Chapter 30 of Pushing to the Front by Orison Swett Marden. Chapter 30. Self-Help. I learned that no man in God's wide earth is either willing or able to help any other man. Pestalozzi. What I am, I have made myself. Humphrey Davy. Be sure, my son, and remember that the best men always make themselves. Patrick Henry. Hereditary bondsmen, know ye not, who would be free themselves must strike the blow. Byron. Who waits to have his task marked out shall die and leave his errand unfulfilled. Lowell. Colonel Crockett makes room for himself, exclaimed a backwoods congressman in answer to the exclamation of the White House usher to "Make room for Colonel Crockett." This remarkable man was not afraid to oppose the head of a great nation. He preferred being right to being president. Though rough, uncultured, and uncouth, Crockett was a man of great courage and determination. "Poverty is uncomfortable, as I can testify," said James A. Garfield. "But 9 times out of 10 the best thing that can happen to a young man is to be tossed overboard and compelled to sink or swim for himself. In all my acquaintance I have never known a man to be drowned who was worth the saving." Garfield was the youngest member of the House of Representatives when he entered, but he had not been in his seat 60 days before his ability was recognized and his place conceded. He stepped to the front with the confidence of one who belonged there. He succeeded because all the world in concert could not have kept him in the background, and because, when once in the front, he played his part with an intrepidity and a commanding ease that were but the outward evidences of the immense reserves of energy on which it was in his power to draw. "Take the place and attitude which belongs to you," says Emerson, "and all men acquiesce. The world must be just. It leaves every man with profound unconcern to set his own rate." "A person under the firm persuasion that he can command resources virtually has them," says Livy. Richard Arkwright, the 13th child in a hovel, with no education, no chance, gave his spinning model to the world, and put a scepter in England's right hand, such as the Queen never wielded. Solario, a wandering gypsy tinker, fell deeply in love with the daughter of the painter Coll Antonio del Fiore, but was told that no one but a painter as good as the father should wed the maiden. "Will you give me 10 years to learn to paint, and so entitle myself to the hand of your daughter?" Consent was given, Coll Antonio thinking that he would never be troubled further by the gypsy. About the time that the 10 years were to end, the king's sister showed Coll Antonio a Madonna and Child, which the painter extolled in terms of the highest praise. Judge of his surprise on learning that Solario was the artist. His great determination gained him his bride. Louis Philippe said he was the only sovereign in Europe fit to govern, for he could black his own boots. When asked to name his family coat of arms, a self-made president of the United States replied, "A pair of shirt sleeves." It is not the men who have inherited most, except it be in nobility of soul and purpose, who have risen highest, but rather the men with no start, who have won fortunes and have made adverse circumstances a spur to goad them up the steep mount, where "fame's proud temple shines afar." To such men every possible goal is accessible, and honest ambition has no height that genius or talent may tread, which has not felt the impress of their feet. You may leave your millions to your son, but have you really given him anything? You cannot transfer the discipline, the experience, the power which the acquisition has given you. You cannot transfer the delight of achieving, the joy felt only in growth, the pride of acquisition, the character which trained habits of accuracy, method, promptness, patience, dispatch, honesty of dealing, politeness of manner have developed. You cannot transfer the skill, sagacity, prudence, foresight, which lie concealed in your wealth. It meant a great deal for you, but means nothing to your heir. In climbing to your fortune, you developed the muscle, stamina, and strength which enabled you to maintain your lofty position, to keep your millions intact. You had the power which comes only from experience, and which alone enables you to stand firm on your dizzy height. Your fortune was experience to you, joy, growth, discipline, and character. To him it will be a temptation, an anxiety, which will probably dwarf him. It was wings to you, it will be a dead weight to him. To you it was education and expansion of your highest powers. To him it may mean inaction, lethargy, indolence, weakness, ignorance. You have taken the priceless spur, necessity, away from him, the spur which has goaded man to nearly all the great achievements in the history of the world. You thought it a kindness to deprive yourself in order that your son might begin where you left off. You thought to spare him the drudgery, the hardships, the deprivations, the lack of opportunities, the meager education which you had on the old farm. But you have put a crutch into his hand instead of a staff. You have taken away from him the incentive to self-development, to self-elevation, to self-discipline and self-help, without which no real success, no real happiness, no great character is ever possible. His enthusiasm will evaporate, his energy will be dissipated, his ambition, not being stimulated by the struggle for self-elevation, will gradually die away. If you do everything for your son and fight his battles for him, you will have a weakling on your hands at 21. "My life is a wreck," said the dying Cyrus W. Field. "My fortune gone, my home dishonored. Oh, I was so unkind to Edward when I thought I was being kind. If I had only had firmness enough to compel my boys to earn their living, then they would have known the meaning of money." His table was covered with medals and certificates of honor from many nations, in recognition of his great work for civilization, in mooring two continents side by side in thought, of the fame he had won and could never lose. But grief shook the sands of life as he thought only of the son who had brought disgrace upon a name before unsullied. The wounds were sharper than those of a serpent's tooth. During the great financial crisis of 1857, Maria Mitchell, who was visiting England, asked an English lady what became of daughters when no property was left them. "They live on their brothers," was the reply. "But what becomes of the American daughters?" asked the English lady, "when there is no money left?" "They earn it," was Miss Mitchell's reply. Men who have been bolstered up all their lives are seldom good for anything in a crisis. When misfortune comes, they look around for somebody to lean upon. If the prop is not there, down they go. Once down, they are as helpless as capsized turtles, or unhorsed men in armor. Many a frontier boy has succeeded beyond all his expectations simply because all props were early knocked out from under him, and he was obliged to stand upon his own feet. A man's best friends are his 10 fingers, said Robert Collier, who brought his wife to America in the steerage. There is no manhood mill which takes in boys and turns out men. What you call no chance may be your only chance. Don't wait for your place to be made for you. Make it yourself. Don't wait for somebody to give you a lift. Lift yourself. Henry Ward Beecher did not wait for a call to a big church with a large salary. He accepted the first pastorate offered him in a little town near Cincinnati. He became literally the light of the church, for he trimmed the lamps, kindled the fires, swept the rooms, and rang the bell. His salary was only about $200 a year, but he knew that a fine church and a great salary cannot make a great man. It was work and opportunity that he wanted. He felt that if there were anything in him, work would bring it out. When Beethoven was examining the work of Moscheles, he found written at the end, "Finis with God's help." He wrote under it, "Man, help yourself." A young man stood listlessly watching some anglers on a bridge. He was poor and dejected. At length, approaching a basket filled with fish, he sighed, "If now I had these, I would be happy. I could sell them and buy food and lodgings." "I will give you just as many and just as good," said the owner, who chanced to overhear his words, "if you will do me a trifling favor." "And what is that?" asked the other. "Only tend this line till I come back. I wish to go on a short errand." The proposal was gladly accepted. The old man was gone so long that the young man began to get impatient. Meanwhile, the fish snapped greedily at the hook, and he lost all his depression in the excitement of pulling them in. When the owner returned, he had caught a large number. Counting out from them as many as were in the basket, and presenting them to the youth, the old fisherman said, "I fulfill my promise from the fish you have caught, to teach you whenever you see others earning what you need to, waste no time in foolish wishing, but cast a line for yourself." A white squall caught a party of tourists on a lake in Scotland, and threatened to capsize the boat. When it seemed that the crisis had really come, the largest and strongest man in the party, in a state of intense fear, said, "Let us pray." "No, no, my man," shouted the bluff old boatman. "Let the little man pray. You take the oar." The grandest fortunes ever accumulated or possessed on earth were and are the fruit of endeavor that had no capital to begin with save energy, intellect, and the will. From Croesus down to Rockefeller, the story is the same, not only in the getting of wealth, but also in the acquirement of eminence. Those men have won most who relied most upon themselves. The male inhabitants in the township of Loaferdom, in the county of Hatework, says a printer's squib, found themselves laboring under great inconvenience, for want of an easily travelled road between poverty and independence. They therefore petitioned the powers that be to levy a tax upon the property of the entire county for the purpose of laying out a macadamized highway, broad and smooth, and all the way downhill to the latter place. Everyone is the artificer of his own fortune, says Sallust. Man is not merely the architect of his own fate, but he must lay the bricks himself. Bayard Taylor, at 23, wrote, "I will become the sculptor of my own mind's statue." His biography shows how often the chisel and hammer were in his hands to shape himself into his ideal. Labor is the only legal tender in the world to true success. The gods sell everything for that, nothing without it. You will never find success marked down. The door to the temple of success is never left open. Everyone who enters makes his own door, which closes behind him to all others. Circumstances have rarely favored great men. They have fought their way to triumph over the road of difficulty and through all sorts of opposition. A lowly beginning and a humble origin are no bar to a great career. The farmers' boys fill many of the greatest places in legislatures, in business, at the bar, in pulpits, in Congress, today. Boys of lowly origin have made many of the greatest discoveries, are presidents of our banks and our colleges, of our universities. Our poor boys and girls have written many of our greatest books and have filled the highest places as teachers and journalists. Ask almost any great man in our large cities where he was born, and he will tell you it was on a farm or in a small country village. Nearly all of the great capitalists of the city came from the country. Isaac Rich, the founder of Boston University, left Cape Cod for Boston to make his way with a capital of only $4. Like Horace Greeley, he could find no opening for a boy. But what of that? He made an opening. He found a board and made it into an oyster stand on the street corner. He borrowed a wheelbarrow and went 3 miles to an oyster smack, bought 3 bushels of oysters, and wheeled them to his stand. Soon his little savings amounted to $130, and then he bought a horse and cart. Self-help has accomplished about all the great things of the world. How many young men falter, faint, and dally with their purpose because they have no capital to start with, and wait for some good luck to give them a lift. But success is the child of drudgery and perseverance. It cannot be coaxed or bribed. Pay the price, and it is yours. Where is the boy today who has less chance to rise in the world than Elihu Burritt, apprenticed to a blacksmith, in whose shop he had to work at the forge all the daylight, and often by candlelight? Yet he managed, by studying with a book before him at his meals, carrying it in his pocket that he might utilize every spare moment, and studying at night and holidays, to pick up an excellent education in the odds and ends of time which most boys throw away. While the rich boy and the idler were yawning and stretching and getting their eyes open, young Burritt had seized the opportunity and improved it. At 30 years of age he was master of every important language in Europe and was studying those of Asia. What chance had such a boy for distinction? Probably not a single youth will read this book who has not a better opportunity for success. Yet he had a thirst for knowledge and a desire for self-improvement, which overcame every obstacle in his pathway. If the youth of America who are struggling against cruel circumstances to do something and be somebody in the world could only understand that 90% of what is called genius is merely the result of persistent, determined industry, in most cases of downright hard work, that it is the slavery to a single idea, which has given to many a mediocre talent the reputation of being a genius, they would be inspired with new hope. It is interesting to note that the men who talk most about genius are the men who like to work the least. The lazier the man, the more he will have to say about great things being done by genius. The greatest geniuses have been the greatest workers. Sheridan was considered a genius, but it was found that the brilliance and offhand sayings with which he used to dazzle the House of Commons were elaborated, polished and repolished, and put down in his memorandum book, ready for any emergency. Genius has been well defined as the infinite capacity for taking pains. If men who have done great things could only reveal to the struggling youth of today how much of their reputations was due to downright hard digging and plodding, what an uplift of inspiration and encouragement they would give! How often I have wished that the discouraged, struggling youth could know of the heartaches, the headaches, the nerve aches, the disheartening trials, the discouraged hours, the fears and the despair involved in works which have gained the admiration of the world, but which have taxed the utmost powers of their authors. You can read in a few minutes or a few hours a poem or a book with only pleasure and delight. But the days and months of weary plodding over details and dreary drudgery often required to produce it would stagger belief. The greatest works in literature have been elaborated and elaborated, line by line, paragraph by paragraph, often rewritten a dozen times. The drudgery which literary men have put into the productions which have stood the test of time is almost incredible. Lucretius worked nearly a lifetime on one poem. It completely absorbed his life. It is said that Bryant rewrote Thanatopsis 100 times, and even then was not satisfied with it. John Foster would sometimes linger a week over a single sentence. He would hack, split, prune, pull up by the roots, or practice any other severity on whatever he wrote, till it gained his consent to exist. Chalmers was once asked what Foster was about in London. "Hard at it," he replied, "at the rate of a line a week." Even Lord Bacon, one of the greatest geniuses that ever lived, at his death left large numbers of manuscripts filled with sudden thoughts set down for use. Hume toiled 13 hours a day on his History of England. Lord Eldon astonished the world with his great legal learning. But when he was a student, too poor to buy books, he had actually borrowed and copied many hundreds of pages of large law books. Matthew Hale for years studied law 16 hours a day. Speaking of Fox, someone declared that he wrote drop by drop. Rousseau says of the labor involved in his smooth and lively style, "My manuscripts, blotted, scratched, interlined, and scarcely legible, attest the trouble they cost me. There is not one of them which I have not been obliged to transcribe 4 or 5 times before it went to press. Some of my periods I have turned or returned in my head for 5 or 6 nights before they were fit to be put to paper." Beethoven probably surpassed all other musicians in his painstaking fidelity and persistent application. There is scarcely a bar in his music that was not written and rewritten at least a dozen times. His favorite maxim was, "The barriers are not yet erected which can say to aspiring talent and industry, 'Thus far and no further.'" Gibbon wrote his autobiography 9 times, and was in his study every morning, summer and winter at 6 o'clock. And yet youth who waste their evenings wonder at the genius which can produce the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, upon which Gibbon worked 20 years. Even Plato, one of the greatest writers that ever lived, wrote the first sentence in his Republic 9 different ways before he was satisfied with it. Burke wrote the conclusion of his speech at the trial of Hastings 16 times, and Butler his famous Analogy 20 times. It took Virgil 7 years to write his Georgics, and 12 years to write the Aeneid. He was so displeased with the latter that he attempted to rise from his deathbed to commit it to the flames. Haydn was very poor. His father was a coachman, and he, friendless and lonely, married a servant girl. He was sent away from home to act as errand boy for a music teacher. He absorbed a great deal of information, but he had a hard life of persecution until he became a barber in Vienna. Here he blacked boots for an influential man, who became a friend to him. In 1798, this poor boy's oratorio, The Creation, came upon the musical world like the rising of a new sun which never set. He was courted by princes and dined with kings and queens. His reputation was made. There was no more barbering, no more poverty. But of his 800 compositions, The Creation eclipsed them all. He died while Napoleon's guns were bombarding Vienna, some of the shot falling in his garden. When a man like Lord Cavanagh, without arms or legs, manages to put himself into Parliament, when a man like Francis Joseph Campbell, a blind man, becomes a distinguished mathematician, a musician, and a great philanthropist, we get a hint as to what it means to make the most possible out of ourselves and our opportunities. Perhaps 99 of 100 under such unfortunate circumstances would be content to remain helpless objects of charity for life. If it is your call to acquire money power instead of brain power, to acquire business power instead of professional power, double your talent just the same, no matter what it may be. A glover's apprentice of Glasgow, Scotland, who was too poor to afford even a candle or a fire, and who studied by the light of the shop windows in the streets, and when the shops were closed, climbed the lamp-post, holding his book in one hand and clinging to the lamp-post with the other. This poor boy, with less chance than almost any boy in America, became the most eminent scholar of Scotland. Francis Parkman, half blind, became one of America's greatest historians in spite of everything, because he made himself such. Personal value is a coin of one's own minting. One is taken at the worth he has put into himself. Franklin was but a poor printer's boy, whose highest luxury at one time was only a penny roll eaten in the streets of Philadelphia. Michael Faraday was a poor boy, son of a blacksmith, who apprenticed him at the age of 13 to a bookbinder in London. Michael laid the foundations of his future greatness by making himself familiar with the contents of the books he bound. He remained at night, after others had gone, to read and study the precious volumes. Lord Tenterden was proud to point out to his son the shop where he had shaved for a penny. A French doctor once taunted Fletcher, Bishop of Nismes, who had been a tallow chandler in his youth, with the meanness of his origin, to which he replied, "If you had been born in the same condition that I was, you would still have been but a maker of candles." Edwin Chadwick, in his report to the British Parliament, stated that children, working on half-time, that is, studying 3 hours a day and working the rest of their time out of doors, really made the greatest intellectual progress during the year. Businessmen have often accomplished wonders during the busiest lives by simply devoting 1, 2, 3, or 4 hours daily to study or other literary work. James Watt received only the rudiments of an education at school, for his attendance was irregular on account of delicate health. He more than made up for all deficiencies, however, by the diligence with which he pursued his studies at home. Alexander V was a beggar. He was born mud and died marble. William Herschel, placed at the age of 14 as a musician in the band of the Hanoverian Guards, devoted all his leisure to philosophical studies. He acquired a large fund of general knowledge, and in astronomy, a science in which he was wholly self-instructed, his discoveries entitled him to rank with the greatest astronomers of all time. George Washington was the son of a widow, born under the roof of a Westmoreland farmer. Almost from infancy, his lot had been that of an orphan. No academy had welcomed him to its shade. No college crowned him with its honors. To read, to write, decipher, these had been his degrees in knowledge. Shakespeare learned little more than reading and writing at school, but by self-culture he made himself the great master among literary men. Burns, too, enjoyed few advantages of education, and his youth was passed in almost abject poverty. James Ferguson, the son of a half-starved peasant, learned to read by listening to the recitations of one of his elder brothers. While a mere boy, he discovered several mechanical principles, made models of mills and spinning wheels, and by means of beads on strings, worked out an excellent map of the heavens. Ferguson made remarkable things with a common penknife. How many great men have mounted the hill of knowledge by out-of-the-way paths? Gifford worked his intricate problems with a shoemaker's awl on a bit of leather. Rittenhouse first calculated eclipses on his plow handle. Columbus, while leading the life of a sailor, managed to become the most accomplished geographer and astronomer of his time. When Peter the Great, a boy of 17, became the absolute ruler of Russia, his subjects were little better than savages, and in himself even the passions and propensities of barbarism were so strong that they were frequently exhibited during his whole career. But he determined to transform himself and the Russians into civilized people. He instituted reforms with great energy, and at the age of 26 started on a visit to the other countries of Europe for the purpose of learning about their arts and institutions. At Saardam, Holland, he was so impressed with the sights of the great East India dockyard that he apprenticed himself to a shipbuilder, and helped to build the St. Peter, which he promptly purchased. Continuing his travels, after he had learned his trade, he worked in England in paper mills, sawmills, rope yards, watchmakers' shops, and other manufactories, doing the work and receiving the treatment of a common laborer. While traveling, his constant habit was to obtain as much information as he could beforehand with regard to every place he was to visit, and he would demand, "Let me see all." When setting out on his investigations on such occasions, he carried his tablets in his hand, and whatever he deemed worthy of remembrance was carefully noted down. He would often leave his carriage if he saw the country people at work by the wayside as he passed along, and not only enter into conversation with them on agricultural affairs, but also accompany them to their homes, examine their furniture, and take drawings of their implements of husbandry. Thus he obtained much minute and correct knowledge, which he would scarcely have acquired by other means, and which he afterward turned to admirable account in the improvement of his own country. The ancients said, "Know thyself." The 20th century says, "Help thyself." Self-culture gives a second birth to the soul. A liberal education is a true regeneration. When a man is once liberally educated, he will generally remain a man, not shrink to a mannequin, nor dwindle to a brute. But if he is not properly educated, if he has merely been crammed and stuffed through college, if he has merely a broken down memory from trying to hold crammed facts enough to pass the examination, he will continue to shrink, shrivel, and dwindle, often below his original proportions, for he will lose both his confidence and self-respect, as his crammed facts, which never became a part of himself, evaporate from his distended memory. Every bit of education or culture is of great advantage in the struggle for existence. The microscope does not create anything new, but it reveals marvels. To educate the eye adds to its magnifying power until it sees beauty where before it saw only ugliness. It reveals a world we never suspected, and finds the greatest beauty even in the commonest things. The eye of an Agassiz could see worlds of which the uneducated eye never dreamed. The cultured hand can do 1,000 things the uneducated hand cannot do. It becomes graceful, steady of nerve, strong, skillful. Indeed, it almost seems to think, so animated is it with intelligence. The cultured will can seize, grasp, and hold the possessor with irresistible power and nerve to almost superhuman effort. The educated touch can almost perform miracles. The educated taste can achieve wonders almost past belief. When a contrast between the cultured, logical, profound, masterly reason of a Gladstone and that of the hod carrier, who has never developed or educated his reason beyond what is necessary to enable him to mix mortar and carry brick. Be careful to avoid that over-intellectual culture which is purchased at the expense of moral vigor. An observant professor of one of our colleges has remarked that the mind may be so rounded and polished by education, and so well balanced as not to be energetic in any one faculty. In other men not thus trained, the sense of deficiency and of the sharp, jagged corners of their knowledge leads to efforts to fill up the chasms, rendering them at last far better educated men than the polished, easy-going graduate who has just knowledge enough to prevent consciousness of his ignorance. While all the faculties of the mind should be cultivated, it is yet desirable that it should have 2 or 3 rough-hewn features of massive strength. Young men are too apt to forget the great end of life, which is to be and to do, not to read and brood over what other men have been and done. I repeat that my object is not to give him knowledge, but to teach him how to acquire it at need, said Rousseau. All learning is self-teaching. It is upon the working of the pupil's own mind that his progress in knowledge depends. The great business of the master is to teach the pupil to teach himself. Thinking, not growth, makes manhood, says Isaac Taylor. Accustom yourself, therefore, to thinking. Set yourself to understand whatever you see or read. To join thinking with reading is one of the first maxims, and one of the easiest operations. How few think justly of the thinking few, how many never think who think they do. End of Chapter 30. Self-Help. Chapter 31 of Pushing to the Front by Orison Swett Marden. Chapter 31. The Self-Improvement Habit. If you want knowledge, you must toil for it. Ruskin. We excuse our sloth under the pretext of difficulty. Quintilian. What sculpture is to a block of marble, education is to the human soul. Addison. A boy is better unborn than untaught. Gascoigne. It is ignorance that wastes, it is knowledge that saves. An untaught faculty is at once quiescent and dead. N. D. Hillis. The plea that this or that man has no time for culture will vanish as soon as we desire culture, so much that we begin to examine seriously into our present use of time. Matthew Arnold. Education, as commonly understood, is the process of developing the mind by means of books and teachers. When education has been neglected, either by reason of lack of opportunity or because advantage was not taken of the opportunities afforded, the one remaining hope is self-improvement. Opportunities for self-improvement surround us. The helps to self-improvement are abundant. And in this day of cheap books and free libraries, there can be no good excuse for neglect to use the faculties for mental growth and development, which are so abundantly supplied. When we look at the difficulties which hindered the acquisition of knowledge 50 years to a century ago, the scarcity and the costliness of books, the value of the dimmest candlelight, the unremitting toil which left so little time for study, the physical weariness which had to be overcome to enable mental exertion in study, we may well marvel at the giants of scholarship those days of hardship produced. And when we add to educational limitations, physical disabilities, blindness, deformity, ill health, hunger and cold, we may feel shame as we contemplate the fullness of modern opportunity and the helps and incentives to study and self-development, which are so lavishly provided for our use and inspiration, and of which we make so little use. Self-improvement implies one essential feeling, the desire for improvement. If the desire exists, then improvement is usually accomplished only by the conquest of self, the material self, which seeks pleasure and amusement. The novel, the game of cards, the billiard cue, idle whittling and storytelling will have to be eschewed, and every available moment of leisure turned to account. For all who seek self-improvement, there is a lion in the way, the lion of self-indulgence, and it is only by the conquest of this enemy that progress is assured. Show me how a youth spends his evenings, his odd bits of time, and I will forecast his future. Does he look upon this leisure as precious, rich in possibilities, as containing golden material for his future life structure? Or does he look upon it as an opportunity for self-indulgence, for a light, flippant good time? The way he spends his leisure will give the keynote of his life, will tell whether he is dead in earnest or whether he looks upon it as a huge joke. He may not be conscious of the terrible effects, the gradual deterioration of character which comes from a frivolous wasting of his evenings and half holidays, but the character is being undermined just the same. Young men are often surprised to find themselves dropping behind their competitors. But if they will examine themselves, they will find that they have stopped growing, because they have ceased their effort to keep abreast of the times, to be widely read, to enrich life with self-culture. It is the right use of spare moments in reading and study which qualify men for leadership, and in many historic cases the spare moments utilized for study were not spare in the sense of being the spare time of leisure. They were rather spared moments. Moments spared from sleep, from meal times, from recreation. Where is the boy today who has less chance to rise in the world than Elihu Burritt, apprenticed at 16 to a blacksmith? In his shop he had to work at the forge all the daylight, and often by candlelight. Yet he managed, by studying with a book before him at his meals, carrying it in his pocket that he might utilize every spare moment, and studying nights and holidays, to pick up an excellent education in the odds and ends of time which most boys throw away. While the rich boy and the idler were yawning and stretching and getting their eyes open, young Burritt had seized the opportunity and improved it. He had a thirst for knowledge and a desire for self-improvement which overcame every obstacle in his pathway. A wealthy gentleman offered to pay his expenses at Harvard, but no, Elihu said he could get his education himself, even though he had to work 12 or 14 hours a day at the forge. Here was a determined boy. He snatched every spare moment at the anvil and forge as if it were gold. He believed, with Gladstone, that thrift of time would repay him in after years with usury, and that waste of it would make him dwindle. Think of a boy working nearly all the daylight in a blacksmith shop, and yet finding time to study 7 languages in a single year. It is not lack of ability that holds men down, but lack of industry. In many cases, the employee has a better brain, a better mental capacity than his employer, but he does not improve his faculties. He dulls his mind by cigarette smoking. He spends his money at the pool table, theatre, or dance, and as he grows old and the harness of perpetual service galls him, he grumbles at his lack of luck, his limited opportunity. The number of perpetual clerks is constantly being recruited by those who do not think it worth while as boys to learn to write a good hand, or to master the fundamental branches of knowledge requisite in a business career. The ignorance common among young men and young women, in factories, stores, and offices everywhere. In fact, in this land of opportunity, where youth should be well educated, is a pitiable thing in American life. On every hand we see men and women of ability occupying inferior positions because they did not think it worth while in youth to develop their powers and to concentrate their attention on the acquisition of sufficient knowledge. Thousands of men and women find themselves held back, handicapped for life, because of the seeming trifles which they did not think it worth while to pay attention to in their early days. Many a girl of good natural ability spends her most productive years as a cheap clerk or in a mediocre position because she never thought it worth while to develop her mental faculties or to take advantage of opportunities within reach to fit herself for a superior position. Thousands of girls, unexpectedly thrown on their own resources, have been held down all their lives because of neglected tasks in youth, which at the time were dismissed with a careless, "I don't think it worth while." They did not think it would pay to go to the bottom of any study at school, to learn to keep accounts accurately, or fit themselves to do anything in such a way as to be able to make a living by it. They expected to marry, and never prepared for being dependent on themselves, a contingency against which marriage, in many instances, is no safeguard. The trouble with most youths is that they are not willing to fling the whole weight of their being into their location. They want short hours, little work, and a lot of play. They think more of leisure and pleasure than of discipline and training in their great life specialty. Many a clerk envies his employer and wishes that he could go into business for himself, be an employer too. But it is too much work to make the effort to rise above a clerkship. He likes to take life easy, and he wonders idly whether, after all, it is worth while to strain and strive and struggle and study to prepare oneself for the sake of getting up a little higher and making a little more money. The trouble with a great many people is that they are not willing to make present sacrifices for future gain. They prefer to have a good time as they go along, rather than spend time in self-improvement. They have a sort of vague wish to do something great, but few have that intensity of longing which impels them to make the sacrifice of the present for the future. Few are willing to work underground for years, laying a foundation for the life monument. They yearn for greatness, but their yearning is not the kind which is willing to pay any price in endeavor or make any sacrifice for its object. So the majority slide along in mediocrity all their lives. They have ability for something higher up, but they have not the energy and determination to prepare for it. They do not care to make necessary effort. They prefer to take life easier and lower down rather than to struggle for something higher. They do not play the game for all they are worth. If a man or woman has but the disposition for self-improvement and advancement, he will find opportunity to rise, or, what he cannot find, create. Here is an example from the everyday life going on around us, and in which we are all taking part. A young Irishman who had reached the age of 19 or 20 without learning to read or write, and who left home because of the intemperance that prevailed there, learned to read a little by studying billboards, and eventually got a position as steward aboard a man-of-war. He chose that occupation and got leave to serve at the captain's table because of a great desire to learn. He kept a little table in his coat pocket, and whenever he heard a new word, wrote it down. One day an officer saw him writing and immediately suspected him of being a spy. When he and the other officers learned what the tablet was used for, the young man was given more opportunities to learn, and these led in time to promotions, until, finally, the sometime steward won a prominent position in the Navy. Success as a naval officer prepared the way for success in other fields. Self-help has accomplished about all the great things of the world. How many young men falter, faint, and dally with their purpose because they have no capital to start with, and wait for some good luck to give them a lift? But success is the child of drudgery and perseverance. It cannot be coaxed or bribed. Pay the price, and it is yours. One of the sad things about the neglected opportunities for self-improvement is that it puts people of great natural ability at a disadvantage among those who are their mental inferiors. I know a member of one of our city legislatures, a splendid fellow, immensely popular, who has a great, generous heart and broad sympathies, but who cannot open his mouth without so murdering the English language that it is really painful to listen to him. There are a great many similar examples in Washington of men who have been elected to important positions because of their great natural ability and fine characters, but who are constantly mortified and embarrassed by their ignorance and lack of early training. One of the most humiliating experiences that can ever come to a human being is to be conscious of possessing more than ordinary ability, and yet be tied to an inferior position because of lack of early and intelligent training commensurate with his ability. To be conscious that one has ability to realize 80 or 90% of his possibilities, if he had only had the proper education and training, but because of this lack, to be unable to bring out more than 25% of it on account of ignorance, is humiliating and embarrassing. In other words, to go through life conscious that you are making a botch of your capabilities just because of lack of training is a most depressing thing. Nothing else outside of sin causes more sorrow than that which comes from not having prepared for the highest career possible to one. There are no bitterer regrets than those which come from being obliged to let opportunities pass by, for which one never prepared himself. I know a pitiable case of a born naturalist whose ambition was so suppressed and whose education so neglected in youth that later, when he came to know more about natural history than almost any man of his day, he could not write a grammatical sentence, and could never make his ideas live in words, perpetuate them in books, because of his ignorance of even the rudiments of an education. His early vocabulary was so narrow and pinched, and his knowledge of his language so limited, that he always seemed to be painfully struggling for words to express his thought. Think of the suffering of this splendid man, who was conscious of possessing colossal scientific knowledge, and yet was absolutely unable to express himself grammatically. How often stenographers are mortified by the use of some unfamiliar word or term or quotation because of the shallowness of their preparation. It is not enough to be able to take dictation when ordinary letters are given, not enough to do the ordinary routine of office work. The ambitious stenographer must be prepared for the unusual demand, must have good reserves of knowledge to draw from in case of emergency. But if she is constantly slipping up upon her grammar, or is all at sea the moment she steps out of her ordinary routine, her employer knows that her preparation is shallow, that her education is very limited, and her prospects will be limited also. A young lady writes me that she is so handicapped by the lack of an early education that she fairly dreads to write a letter to anyone of education or culture for fear of making ignorant mistakes in grammar and spelling. Her letter indicates that she has a great deal of natural ability, yet she is much limited and always placed at a disadvantage because of this lack of an early education. It is difficult to conceive of a greater misfortune than always to be embarrassed and handicapped just because of the neglect of those early years. I am often pained by letters from people, especially young people, which indicate that the writers have a great deal of natural ability, that they have splendid minds, but a large part of their ability is covered up, rendered ineffectual by their ignorance. Many of these letters show that the writers are like diamonds in the rough, with only here and there a little facet ground off, just enough to let in the light and reveal the great hidden wealth within. I always feel sorry for these people who have passed the school age and who will probably go through life with splendid minds, handicapped by their ignorance, which, even late in life, they might largely or entirely overcome. It is such a pity that a young man, for instance, who has the natural ability which would make him a leader among men, must, for the lack of a little training, a little preparation, work for somebody else, perhaps with but half of his ability, but with a better preparation, more education. Everywhere we see clerks, mechanics, employees in all walks of life, who cannot rise to anything like positions which correspond with their natural ability, because they have not had the education. They are ignorant. They cannot write a decent letter. They murder the English language, and hence their superb ability cannot be demonstrated and remains in mediocrity. The parable of the talents illustrates and enforces one of nature's sternest laws. To him that hath shall be given. From him that hath not shall be taken away even that which he hath. Scientists call this law the survival of the fittest. The fittest are those who use what they have, who gain strength by struggle, and who survive by self-development, by control of their hostile or helpful environment. The soil, the sunshine, the atmosphere are very liberal with the material for the growth of the plant or the tree. But the plant must use all it gets. It must work it up into flowers, into fruit, into leaf or fiber or something, or the supply will cease. In other words, the soil will not send any more building material up the sap than is used for growth, and the faster this material is used, the more rapid the growth, the more abundantly the material will come. The same law holds good everywhere. Nature is liberal with us if we utilize what she gives us. But if we stop using it, if we do not transform what she gives us into power, if we do not do some building somewhere, if we do not transform the material which she gives us into force and utilize that force, we not only find the supply cut off, but we find that we are growing weaker, less efficient. Everything in nature is on the move, either one way or the other. It is either going up or down. It is either advancing or retrograding. We cannot hold without using. Nature withdraws muscle or brain if we do not use them. She withdraws skill the moment we stop drilling efficiently, the moment we stop using our power. The force is withdrawn when we cease exercising it. A college graduate is often surprised, years after he leaves the college, to find that about all he has to show for his education is his diploma. The power, the efficiency which he gained there has been lost because he has not been using them. He thought at the time that everything was still fresh in his mind after his examination, that his knowledge would remain with him. But it has been slipping away from him every minute since he stopped using it, and only that has remained and increased which he has used. The rest has evaporated. A great many college graduates 10 years afterwards find that they have but very little left to show for their 4 years course, because they have not utilized their knowledge. They have become weaklings without knowing it. They constantly say to themselves, "I have a college education. I must have some ability. I must amount to something in the world." But the college diploma has no more power to hold the knowledge you have gained in college than a piece of tissue paper over a gas jet can hold the gas in the pipe. Everything which you do not use is constantly slipping away from you. Use it or lose it. The secret of power is use. Ability will not remain with us. Force will evaporate the moment we cease to do something with it. The tools for self-improvement are at your hand. Use them. If the axe is dull, the more strength must be put forth. If your opportunities are limited, you must use more energy, put forth more effort. Progress may seem slow at first, but perseverance assures success. Line upon line, and precept upon precept, is the rule of mental upbuilding, and in due time ye shall reap if ye faint not. End of chapter 31. The Self-Improvement Habit. Chapter 32 of Pushing to the Front by Orison Swett Marden. Chapter 32. Raising of Values. Destiny is not about thee, but within. Thyself must make thyself. The world is no longer clay, but rather iron in the hands of its workers, says Emerson, and men have got to hammer out a place for themselves by steady and rugged blows. To make the most of your stuff, be it cloth, iron, or character, this is success. Raising common stuff to priceless value is great success. The man who first takes the rough bar of wrought iron may be a blacksmith who has only partly learned his trade and has no ambition to rise above his anvil. He thinks that the best possible thing he can do with his bar is to make it into horseshoes, and congratulates himself upon his success. He reasons that the rough lump of iron is worth only 2 or 3 cents a pound, and that it is not worthwhile to spend much time or labor on it. His enormous muscles and small skill have raised the value of the iron from $1 perhaps to $10. Along comes a cutler with a little better education, a little more ambition, a little finer perception, and says to the blacksmith, "Is this all you can see in that iron? Give me a bar and I will show you what brains and skill and hard work can make of it." He sees a little further into the rough bar. He has studied many processes of hardening and tempering. He has tools, grinding and polishing wheels, and annealing furnaces. The iron is fused, carbonized into steel, drawn out, forged, tempered, heated white hot, plunged into cold water or oil to improve its temper, and ground and polished with great care and patience. When this work is done, he shows the astonished blacksmith $2,000 worth of knife blades, where the latter only saw $10 worth of crude horseshoes. The value has been greatly raised by the refining process. Knife blades are all very well, if you can make nothing better, says another artisan, to whom the cutler has shown the triumph of his art. But you haven't half brought out what is in that bar of iron. I see a higher and better use. I have made a study of iron, and know what there is in it, and what can be made of it. This artisan has a more delicate touch, a finer perception, a better training, a higher ideal, and superior determination, which enable him to look still further into the molecules of the rough bar, past the horseshoes, past the knife blades, and he turns the crude iron into the finest cambric needles, with eyes cut with microscopic exactness. The production of the invisible points requires a more delicate process, a finer grade of skill than the cutler possesses. This feat the last workman considers marvelous, and he thinks he has exhausted the possibilities of the iron. He has multiplied many times the value of the cutler's product. But behold, another very skillful mechanic, with a more finely organized mind, a more delicate touch, more patience, more industry, a higher order of skill, and a better training, passes with ease by the horseshoes, the knife blades, and the needles, and returns the product of his bar in fine mainsprings for watches. Where the others saw horseshoes, knife blades, or needles, worth only a few $1,000, his penetrating eye saw a product worth $100,000. A higher artisan appears, who tells us that the rough bar has not even yet found its highest expression, that he possesses the magic that can perform a still greater miracle in iron. To him, even mainsprings seem coarse and clumsy. He knows that the crude iron can be manipulated and coaxed into an elasticity that cannot even be imagined by one less trained in metallurgy. He knows that, if care enough be used in tempering the steel, it will not be stiff, trenchant, and merely a passive metal, but so full of its new qualities that it almost seems instinct with life. With penetrating, almost clairvoyant vision, this artisan sees how every process of mainspring making can be carried further, and how at every stage of manufacture more perfection can be reached, how the texture of the metal can be so much refined that even a fiber, a slender thread of it, can do marvelous work. He puts his bar through many processes of refinement and fine tempering, and, in triumph, turns his product into almost invisible coils of delicate hair springs. After infinite toil and pain, he has made his dream true. He has raised the few dollars' worth of iron to a value of $1 million, perhaps 40 times the value of the same weight of gold. Still another workman, whose processes are so almost infinitely delicate, whose product is so little known by even the average educated man, that his trade is unmentioned by the makers of dictionaries and encyclopedias, takes but a fragment of one of the bars of steel, and develops its higher possibilities with such marvelous accuracy, such ethereal fineness of touch, that even mainsprings and hairsprings are looked back upon as coarse, crude, and cheap. When his work is done, he shows you a few of the minutely barbed instruments used by dentists to draw out the finest branches of the dental nerves. While a pound of gold, roughly speaking, is worth about $250, a pound of these slender, barbed filaments of steel, if a pound could be collected, might be worth hundreds of times as much. Other experts may still further refine the product, but it will be many a day before the best will exhaust the possibilities of a metal that can be subdivided until its particles will float in the air. It sounds magical, but the magic is only that wrought by the application of the homeliest virtues, by the training of the eye, the hand, the perception, by painstaking care, by hard work, and by determination and grit. If a metal, possessing only a few coarse material qualities, is capable of such marvelous increase in value by mixing brains with its molecules, who shall set bounds to the possibilities of the development of a human being, that wonderful compound of physical, mental, moral, and spiritual forces? Whereas in the development of iron, a dozen processes are possible. 1,000 influences may be brought to bear upon mind and character. While the iron is an inert mass, acted upon by external influences only, the human being is a bundle of forces, acting and counteracting, yet all capable of control and direction by the higher self, the real, dominating personality. The difference in human attainment is due only slightly to the original material. It is the ideal followed and unfolded, the effort made, the processes of education and experience undergone that fuse, hammer, and mold our life bar into its ultimate development. Life, everyday life, has counterparts of all the tortures the iron undergoes, and through them it comes to its highest expression. The blows of opposition, the struggles amid want and woe, the fiery trials of disaster and bereavement, the crushings of iron circumstances, the raspings of care and anxiety, the grinding of constant difficulties, the rebuffs that chill enthusiasm, the weariness of years of dry, dreary drudgery in education and discipline, all these are necessary to the man who would reach the highest success. The iron, by this manipulation, is strengthened, refined, made more elastic or more resistant, and adapted to the use each artisan dreams of. If every blow should fracture it, if every furnace should burn the life out of it, if every roller should pulverize it, of what use would it be? It has that virtue, those qualities that withstand all, that draw profit from every test, and come out triumphant in the end. In the iron, the qualities are, in the main, inherent. But in ourselves, they are largely matters of growth, culture, and development, and all are subject to the dominating will. Just as each artisan sees in the crude iron some finished, refined product, so must we see in our lives glorious possibilities, if we would but realize them. If we see only horseshoes or knife blades, all our efforts and struggles will never produce hairsprings. We must realize our own adaptability to great ends. We must resolve to struggle, to endure trials and tests, to pay the necessary price, confident that the result will pay us for our suffering, our trials, and our efforts. Those who shrink from the forging, the rolling, and the drawing out are the ones who fail, the nobodies, the faulty characters, the criminals. Just as a bar of iron, if exposed to the elements, will oxidize and become worthless, so will character deteriorate if there is no constant effort to improve its form, to increase its ductility, to temper it, or to better it in some way. It is easy to remain a common bar of iron, or comparatively so, by becoming merely a horseshoe. But it is hard to raise your life product to higher values. Many of us consider our natural gift bars poor, mean, and inadequate, compared with those of others. But if we are willing, by patience, toil, study, and struggle, to hammer, draw out, and refine, to work on and up from clumsy horseshoes to delicate hairsprings, we can, by infinite patience and persistence, raise the value of the raw material to almost fabulous heights. It was thus that Columbus, the weaver, Franklin, the journeyman printer, Aesop, the slave, Homer, the beggar, Demosthenes, the cutler's son, Ben Jonson, the bricklayer, Cervantes, the common soldier, and Haydn, the poor wheelwright's son, developed their powers until they towered head and shoulders above other men. There is very little difference between the material given to 100 average boys and girls at birth, yet one with no better means of improvement than the others, perhaps with infinitely poorer means, will raise his material in value 100-fold, 500-fold, 1,000-fold, while the 99 will wonder why their material remains so coarse and crude, and will attribute their failure to hard luck. While one boy is regretting his want of opportunities, his lack of means to get a college education, and remains in ignorance, another, with half his chances, picks up a good education in the odds and ends of time which other boys throw away. From the same material, one man builds a palace and another a hovel. From the same rough piece of marble, one man calls out an angel of beauty which delights every beholder, another a hideous monster which demoralizes everyone who sees it. The extent to which you can raise the value of your life bar depends very largely upon yourself. Whether you go upward to the mainspring or hairspring stage depends very largely upon your ideal, your determination to be the higher thing, upon your having the grit to be hammered, to be drawn out, to be thrust from the fire into cold water or oil in order to get the proper temper. Of course, it is hard and painful, and it takes lots of stamina to undergo the processes that produce the finest product. But would you prefer to remain a rough bar of iron or a horseshoe all your life? End of chapter 32, Raising of Values.